Okay, I think we can start now due to time constraint. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you being here today, and especially those who traveled from afar. And this session, as you know, will be addressing the past achievement and future directions of UN Gge, UN Group of Government Experts in Information Security. It is an immense privilege for me to have such a distinguished panel for this theme. You know, Korea is often referred to as in the front line in terms of cyber threat. As one of the most wired countries in the world, Korea has enjoyed enormous benefits derived from ICTs, but also it has been a kind of test bed for state-of-the-art technologies to be used with very bad intentions. Experiencing a series of the cyber attacks, particularly against critical infrastructure such as nuclear plant operator, banking, and transportation system, Korean people became acutely aware of graveness of threats they face. So I think today's discussion with regard to cyberspace, cybersecurity, is very relevant to my country as well as the entire world. Among many things we need to address with regard to cyberspace, lacking governing rules deserves special attention as a key challenge for global community in addressing those threats emanating from cyberspace. In this context, it is very appropriate at Jejuporum to discuss on the UN Information Security Gge. As in the law of the sea or outer space, the UN is the most legitimate body to deal with issues that have impact across the globe, namely cybersecurity. Since its establishment in 2004, UN Information Security Gge has addressed applicability of existing international law and availability of norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and other important issues such as confidence building measures and capacity building. The Korean government, we appreciate and support landmark conclusions made by this Gge, despite differences in the views among participants. And now it is for us very important to continue to discuss about the ways to secure more secured cyberspace. So having that said, I think still we do not have enough consensus on the Beijing rules, such as what kind of behaviors are not accepted in cyberspace, and how each state can respond to the malicious activities in cyberspace, how to deal with the malicious activities committed by non-state actors. The list goes on and on. Absence of rules is one of the key factors keeping us from having robust cooperative mechanisms to deal with cyber threat. So I expect today's discussion will provide us with useful food for thought on how to create sound cyber environment where everyone can safely enjoy the benefits from ICTs. So we have today the 5 speakers joining us, and let me introduce all the 5 speakers. First, Anaken Ringas, to my left, senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Professor Bang No-hyung of Korea University, and Mika Kertunen, Director of Studies at the Cyber Policy Institute, and John Mallory, Research Scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and lastly, William Busby, former Deputy Director of Legal Services in British Royal Air Force. So I will first ask Dr. Ringas to present her PowerPoint presentation for 15 to 20 minutes, and then invite other speakers to comment and discuss for about 5 minutes for 1 or 2 rounds, and then I hope we could reserve some time to open the floor from the audience. So without further ado, Dr. Ringas, you have the floor. You go to the podium. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, and I'm very grateful for the invitation here and for an opportunity to talk about a very pertinent security issue, cybersecurity, under the aegis of peace and prosperity. Because I think we often overlook this when we focus on security. What is it for? It is my task and pleasure to walk you maybe through some necessary framework for understanding the current UN Gge의 conversations and discourse, where we stand and how we got here. So I'm going to talk to 4 main points. I will explain the background, the way I have studied and experienced it as being part of the Estonian delegation to the UN Gge for the past two sessions. Then I will go into the process as such, how it has gone on for the past 6 years, where substantive progress have been made on some of the issues we're discussing. I will focus then on the upcoming Gge and some of the expectations towards that. And finally, I will offer some considerations for Korea, because I think every country wants to go to those conversations with a very solid position that reinforces their national priorities and strengths. But let me then turn to the background. And when talking about the UN Gge and how it gets started, I think we need to go back more than the 1998, the year that it was started. I think the 1990s were a remarkable decade in that they provided insights both into the military potential of ICTs by way of digitalizing the battlefield. So that's the right-hand column of examples. But then the same decade, as you see on the left, actually witnessed the rise of the global internet. In less than 10 years, 194 countries became connected to the internet backbone. 10 million websites from zero came to being, and 300 million got connected on 1 decade alone. Why I'm talking about these parallel developments? Because these 2 parallel developments form the context, and as I would say also the confrontation of the international cybersecurity discourse. Both the cyber domain and the global internet come together in how we discuss these issues today. Countries with preference of centralized communications do not necessarily embrace the call for freedom of information, and we need to keep that in mind. Whereas technologically less advanced countries also see the development of military use and capabilities of ICTs as a threat to international peace and security. So in the light of the above, the 1998 was a year that the Russian Federation presented a draft resolution to the UN Secretary General. And the request from Russia was for the first committee, the Disarmament Committee of the UN, to look into preventive measures against the creation of what was named information weapons and the threat of information wars. And Russians have said that the very rhetoric of their draft resolution came from the doctrinal language of the United States. In particular, the Russian Federation called for exchange at the time of national views related to the use of ICTs for military purposes, and the advisability of developing international legal regimes to prohibit the development, production, or use of particular dangerous forms of information weapons. For the 6 years after 1998, however, Russia remained the sole sponsor of their resolution. The US and the like-minded, on the other hand, preferred emphasis on cybercrime and critical infrastructure protection. And this is how, in the UN, 3 different discourses were started. And in many ways, they are ongoing today. So, in the second committee and third committee, the resolutions or the processes on global culture of cybersecurity and criminal misuse of information technologies were tabled. So for 10 years, countries remained divided even on whether the issue of international peace and security in the context of ICTs was worth discussing. And it was only after the cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008 that the international cybersecurity issue became subject to high foreign politics. The subsequent years, however, have offered ample of food for thought on how both states and non-state actors have come to use ICTs in pursuit of their motives, both political, military, and economic. So, coming to the UN First Committee process of the Gge, the group of governmental experts, then the idea to convene a group of governmental experts to discuss matter of international peace and security in the context of ICTs, as I said, came from Russia, but it was tabled only in 2003. And this group of governmental experts, consisting originally 15 members, last time 20, and the upcoming Gge is expected to have 25 members, is required to achieve consensus on these issues. So all experts have to agree to the final report, which is then submitted to the Secretary General. Well, for the reasons discussed above briefly, the first ever Gge, the 2004-2005 Gge chaired by Russia, failed to achieve consensus. And the chair of that session, Ambassador Krutsky, has observed that it was almost as if not just people with different language backgrounds came together, but people who had very different understanding of ICTs and how they're used. In 2010, however, 15 countries were able to agree that threats in the sphere of information security were among the most serious challenges of the 21st century. And they noted that the same ICTs that support robust e-commerce could also be used to threaten international peace and security. And this is where we see this twofold agenda of the Gge forming. About the global internet, its potential, but then also the cyber domain and the military uses of that. The 2010 Gge recommended focus on confidence building in this situation and also cybersecurity related capacity building. It was further emphasized that further discussion is required on norms pertaining to state use of ICTs. But the group in 2010 had little to say about the norms themselves. Although the US and the like-minded argued for the applicability of existing international law, Russia and China at the time concluded that the criteria for applying and adopting international law to interstate relations in the field of ICTs were still lacking. So indeed, the breakthrough on norms came on 2013 when the Gge crafted a careful consensus. The consensus of 2013 is a tricky one. It is often cited, paragraph 19 of the report, that says international law, and in particular the Charter of the United Nations, is applicable and is essential to maintaining peace and stability and promoting an open, secure, peaceful, and accessible ICT environment. However, there is essential pretext, or I would say as important sentences in paragraph 16 of the same report, which emphasize that the consensus on concluding that international law was applicable was subject to further development of common understanding of how such norms apply, and also the open option of further norms be required over time. The 2013 report was particularly contested on the applicability of IHL, or law of armed conflict. The US State Department, immediately after the report came out, rushed to conclude that consensus on the applicability of international law also included law of armed conflict. However, the rhetoric of Russia and China raised doubts as to whether such interpretation was compliant with the group's deliberations. The value of the 2013 report is also that it divided the discussion of responsible state behavior in two separate but related categories. First, the applicability of existing international law and the current focus on how it is to be applied to the uses of ICTs. And second, the question of developing additional non-binding norms that take into account the complexity and unique attributes of ICTs. It is also that in both of those categories, binding legal obligations and voluntary norms, there are sub-discussions or sub-discourses. So the existing international law discussion divides into peacetime and wartime, and then the norms, rules, and principles divide into already existing guidance and then new recommendations on such norms. However, it was only the 2014-15, that means the latest Gge, that really opened up the international law and norms discourse. The report, in fact, clarified both accounts. So this is how the existing international law discourse divided on two clearly distinguishable focal areas, IHL and peacetime norms. However, the other section, norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior, identified then voluntary, non-binding norms for stability and security in the global ICT environment. This section intended to address norms and principles that do not limit or prohibit action that is otherwise consistent with international law. A brief analysis of the current list of norms, rules, and principles includes three types of entries by countries. First, attempts to clarify existing international law. Then, reaffirmations of normative considerations that remain beyond the immediate mandate of the first committee, such as, for example, human rights and critical infrastructure protection. And then new practical norms, such as security of the supply chain or protection of computer emergency teams. On the application of existing international law, the 2015 report goes on to list a number of existing norms and principles that the experts have considered applicable to state uses. The upcoming Gge is worth a thought, because since 1998, 102 countries have come to sponsor the first committee resolution. More than 60 countries have reportedly sent in their written replies to the resolution. And membership of the Gge, as I said, has been increased from 15 to now 25, and still more than double of that number of countries are interested in being part of it. Meanwhile, the statistics of malicious and hostile activities in cyberspace have been growing alongside with the internet penetration. And most importantly, so far the UN Gge remains the only venue in which matters of international peace and security are discussed in the context of ICTs. So this all sets a very high expectation to the upcoming Gge. Of particular importance in the conversation is the intertwinement of the global internet and the cyber domain, because these two notions meet under the term cyberspace. And therefore, the first committee negotiations, or the UN Gge conversations, more importantly, precisely, can become very nuanced and very compromise averse. Some of the positions that the upcoming Gge is expected to tackle are easily observable in the leading cyber powers' narratives. There is an increasing quest for cyber stability, understood by the US as a climate in which all states are able to enjoy the benefits of cyberspace, all have incentives to cooperate and avoid conflict, or all have good reason not to disrupt or attack each other. There is also a proposition to focus on what the US and like-minded refer to as peacetime norms, such as norms of sovereignty, state responsibility. However, China has explicitly rejected any further talks on IHL. And the Chinese approach to cyber weapons increasingly appears to be a ban of those weapons and capabilities. On the Russian side, there probably could be an opening for the rules of engagement discussion, but this team has been, I think, quarantined by requests that the Gge next focus on prevention of cyber incidents rather than discuss Articles 2, 4, and 51 of the UN Charter in great detail. So the shared Sino-Russo emphasis is on the peace-maintaining nature of the UN Charter. There are very likely contributions to the non-binding norms section. The Netherlands has promoted a norm of inviolability of the core internet infrastructure. It is very likely that the issue of due diligence will be tabled by some countries. And as Secretary Kerry reminded us in Seoul a year ago, every government has a responsibility to provide security to its citizens. The US has actually echoed further norms that have not yet been discussed on the in the UN Gge, and those can be also traced in, for example, Secretary Kerry's talk. References made to trade secrets, also malicious cyber activity prevention or curbing, and then help to states that are victimized by cyber attacks. Further on the table are recommendations to better understand the private sector views on the issue, and there is an expectation of the Gge to clarify applicability of international law in a universally accepted manner. Inevitably, such the clarifications have to remain on a principle level, meaning that is how far the UN Gge can go. And in this regard, the recent proposal of the Estonian Minister of Foreign Affairs merits attention. So she referred to the Martens Clause that was used when laws and customs of war of land were drafted more than a century ago. And she really referred to the idea that we commit to providing maximum guarantees under existing international law, even when we keep debating about the details of it. Beyond 2017, just to add a sentence, Russia has questioned the viability of the Gge as a working format. And on the other hand, there is an ever-increasing amount of countries willing to be part of the discourse, so the expert group cannot be stretched indefinitely. Finally, on considerations for Korea, and I'm sure we get into more detailed conversation of that, but there is obviously a rich menu of possible contributions to the work of the upcoming UN Gge, and I think it's very essential that any national contributions emphasize the experience and priorities of respective countries. So Korea ranks first in the UN e-government development index. And I think that brings a very positive agenda to link the security dialogue to. Korea holds one place among 15 in the ICT industry's world top list. And the other two countries there are US and India, and I think that places those countries all very well in a position to start looking into the private sector angle of these issues. I think Korean experience with cyber attacks by both state and non-state actors is very valuable because it places it among those countries in the Gge who have first-hand experience in mitigating large-scale attacks. And I have also learned that Korea brings excellent examples of best practices, such as I was just in Gaborone last week hearing from KISA on DDoS sheltering, and I think other very practical things that would add to the conversation of what constitutes due diligence at the national level. Very finally, I think that we need to be able, especially as countries developing their views right now, to factor in parallel vision of not just ICT and cybersecurity discourse, but the conversations we are having on unmanned systems, autonomous systems, and other advanced technologies, because the law cannot be different for those developments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very comprehensive the presentation. I think you set the tone very rightly, and then I think we can have a very interesting discussion based on your presentation. So, you know, as we all know, our due share of time has been eaten out by the previous session, so we should be very time conscious. So I'll be very strict to the time limits. So maybe now I give the floor to the 4 panelists. They have, for the first time, to 5 minutes each, and then if there's any need, we can have the second round, and then we'll open the floor to the audience. So without further ado, I give the floor to the Professor Park.
Thank you, moderator. I speak in Korean. 오늘 세션 주제가 UNGG in Information Security의 활동인데요. 한국은 이제 1차, 2차, 4차 UNGG에 참여를 했고요. 우리 발제자께서 말씀하신 대로 3차 GG에서 UN 헌장을 포함한 기존의 국제법이 국가의 ICT 이용, 즉 사이버 공간에 적용된다 했고, 4차 GG에서 이 국제법이 어떻게 사이버 공간에 적용될 것인지를 집중적으로 논의를 했습니다. 근데 이 4차 UNGG에서 보면은 사실 이 GG 자체가 Group of Governmental Experts에서 정부 전문가 그룹 회의인데, 그 정부 전문가이기보다는 그 정부 대표로서 이 규범이 구체적으로 어떻게 합의될 수 있는지에 대해서 정말 치열하게 싸우고 협상하는 것을 볼 수 있었습니다. 그런데 이 미국이나 중국, 러시아와 같은 뭐 P5 강대국들, 그리고 이제 한국이나 일본과 같은 이제 중견국이랄까요? 그런 국가들에서는 그런대로 이러한 그 엑스퍼티즈가 잘 준비가 되고 또 보강이 되고 했는데, 또 보면은 그 20개 국가들 중에 또 그렇지 못한 국가들이 있어서 이 중간에 그 소위 정부 전문가들의 모임인데도 불구하고 그 좀 엉뚱한 게 좀 시간이 지체된 경우도 있었고요. 그렇게 된 연유 때문인지 몰라도 그 4차 UNGG 회의가 끝난 후에 또 이 GG의 그 멤버십이 20개에서 25개로 확장되는 결정이 있은 후에는 그 유니디르나 또는 미국의 CSIS와 같은 국제기구들 중심으로, 그리고 이 에스토니아나 네덜란드와 같은 이 사이버 이슈에 관심 있는 국가들 중심으로 일종의 그 워크숍이 그동안에 진행이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 이 8월 달에 5차 UNGG가 이제 시작되지만은 4차 UNGG부터 5차 UNGG까지 계속 이 GG 활동을 위한 또 활동이 지속되고 있는 것을 보았습니다. 저는 이제 특히 이제 내분의 이 사이버 시큐리티 분야에서 정말 국제적으로 점유하신 분들을 모신 자리이기 때문에 제가 더 깊이 들어가지는 않겠고요. 한두 가지 질문을 일단 제가 에네켄 발제자께 드리고자 합니다. 근데 그 전에 저는 이제 고대 법대고 저희 사이버법 센터에서 왔는데, 그 하나 저희가 그 광고를 하나 하면은 아까 발제 중에 그 Security Carries Talk라고 언급을 하셨는데, 그게 작년 5월 18일 날 그 케리 국무장관이 저희 고대에서 인천강좌에서 특강을 하셨고, 공식적으로는 저희 고대 사이버법 센터에 그 초청을 받아서 오신 건데, 그 연설문 자체가 현재의 미국의 사이버 시큐리티 또는 사이버 파일럿에 대한 그 근거안을 지금 이루고 있는 점에서 여러분들도 미국 국무부 사이트 가셔서 좀 보시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 저 두 가지 질문을 에네켄한테 드리겠습니다. 오케이. 일단 20개 나라에서 25개 나라로 이 멤버십이 확대되는 UNGG에서 그동안에 이제 소위 라이크 마인디드에서 미국 중심의 서방 국가들 그리고 러시아 중심의 또 그렇지 않은 국가들 그런데 이 25개로 확대가 되면은 그 사이에서 소위 third voice가 나올 수 있는지 그럴 가능성이 있을지 그것이 또 UNGG 5차 UNGG의 활동에 어떤 영향을 줄지 그게 하나 궁금하고요. 또 하나는 작년부터 지금까지 미국과 근데 오바마 대통령하고 시진핑 주석하고 사이에 작년 9월인가요? 그래서 그 사이버 에스피오나지를 하지 말자 등에 관한 그런 합의가 계속되어 왔고 또 금년에 4월 달에 보면은 제네바에서 미국하고 러시아 또 러시아하고 나토 간에 또 그러한 또 회동이 있었고 그래서 그러한 회동의 결과가 특히 금년 회동 결과는 어떻게 지금 바깥으로 알려져 있는지 모르겠습니다만 하여튼 이런 소위 그 초관객들 사이에 그러한 미팅이 그 5차 UNGG의 그 전망을 더 밝게 하고 있는지 또는 뭐 별로인지 그런 점에 대해서 좀 여쭙겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you, Professor Park. So I'll give the floor to next panelist, Mr. Keretinen. You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for the organizers of inviting us all here. It's a great honor and pleasure of speaking and trying to make an impact. After two distinguished international law scholars, I'm in a position to provide the international relations point of view to the UN-Gge. As a process, not that much of the content, although I have a couple of content issues as well. So I have a structure of three. If you don't hear three things, then I have missed. First is challenges, the second is added value, and the third one is ways forward. If I have any time, I can offer some, if I'm allowed, a couple of Korea-relevant points as well. But first, challenges, three challenges. The first one is exclusion. Gge has been an exclusive club of 15 and now up to 25 countries. Although the membership or participation is global and regionally organized, it leaves questions of which countries are in and which are out and on what grounds. Another issue of representation is what Eneken already pointed out, how to bring the private sector views to the international level, as well as, for example, the views of the civil society. It is not enough, my view, that there are conferences, venues, and fora for civil society, as well as industrial or the private sector, that they themselves speak of relevant things, but how to systematize that input to the Gge international UN level, that is a question. The second challenge is what I call exhaustion. So it comes to this: how many times do we need to reply that the international law is applicable without going into the content of it? How many times it is repeated when the countries start to ask, does this emperor has a clothes at all? So where's the substance of that, as such, extremely valuable principle? And the third one is that the Gge reports, although crafted painfully in a year-long process and then welcomed or endorsed by the UN General Assembly, they are not binding. They don't bind even the countries who participate in crafting and drafting the reports. Although there is a more positive angle on that as well. So that leaves me to the second point of what is then the added value of the whole enterprise. Well, to have a forum like that, the Gge, it forces countries to listen, even sometimes hear what the others are saying. It forces the cyber troika, the big three, listen to countries like Estonia, Korea, Ghana, Kenya, you name it, Cuba, for example, perhaps in the next coming round. So it is a value. It has its intrinsic value of its own. Secondly, by crafting the report and coming up with those points that Enneken presented, the Gge and the countries draw boundaries between responsible and intolerable state behavior. Although unbinding, there comes some kind of a common understanding what is okay and what is not okay. It needs to be substantiated, but still there is some common ground, lowest common denominator to build on. And thirdly, Gge promotes cybersecurity. We can name it the global culture of cybersecurity or cybersecurity awareness at international level and at national level. It educates, socializes countries to cybersecurity, not necessarily at the technical level issues, but on a peace and security, peace and prosperity level issues. Ways forward. I have already mentioned the first point, and it is this how to. We need to substantiate all the Gge, the coming Gge, and the future processes need to go into this 2013 report notions of further study or additional norms. We need to put meat on the bones of the big principles. Secondly, confidence-building measures can be developed as concrete tools for global as well as regional stability. Confidence-building measures usually are presented in an order of first transparency measures, then cooperation measures, and then we can move into stability measures. I challenge that order. Why not have stability measures with somebody you don't like but you distrust? You are not to cooperate with the other, but you may have some stability building measures there. For example, no targeting policy, cooperation, for example, among countries, duty to assist in case of cyber incidents and attacks, and transparency measure. My favorite norm is, or to be a norm, I would like to see that a country having a national cybersecurity strategy should become a norm. Not a written norm, but a sort of a social norm, because it promotes transparency, it shows government responsibility of taking action and being responsible before the international community as well as before its own people. So those were my 3 points. Korea shortly. I'm a Finn. I'm privileged to be part of the Estonian team, not the delegation, but the team supporting the Estonian Gge efforts. And my first observation as well as advice to Estonians was that, hey, this is no legal enterprise. It's a political enterprise. It's a political game. It's a geopolitical game. Estonia, as well as Korea or any country, should define what is her national ambition, and then mold legal, political, technical, whatever takes according to that ambition. Being a scholarly right, whether it's a IR theory or legal theory, doesn't matter. It matters at the university, think tanks and academic papers, but not at the Gge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very thought-provoking comments. So we have exactly 40 minutes to go. So now I give the floor to John Mallory. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. It's working. Thanks very much for inviting me to this. 5 minutes is always an interesting challenge because you have to know what your points are to get them into 5 minutes. And given the great presentations that have come before, I sort of do two things just for openers, is to remind you that the first committee effort is political military. So we're really sort of talking about military dynamics. And even though there's work in intellectual property issues, it's really more of a trade issue. And then it's not really a big power dynamics because they can do their bilaterals. It's really multilateral. And so it's really thinking of, what are the kinds of norms and behaviors which would be desirable in order to stabilize the international system. And in some sense, it's a pre-law exercise, modulo the application of law to the cyber domain, which is an important activity. So that if you consider the nature of the problem, which is essentially that there are different problems, but we'll stick to the political military one, which is that you can attack other countries through cyber. And the cyber infrastructure is created mostly by private sector with annual sales of something like 4.3 trillion per year. And there's limited incentives for businesses to pursue high assurance technologies that would reduce the opportunity for malicious actors. Indeed, there's science from the 70s that has not been implemented. So the result is that this engine of wonderful positive activities and economic growth and so forth is proliferating attack surfaces. So there's now increasing vulnerabilities that are being imposed on everyone. And in order to modernize today, you have to use computers. In this context, we have malicious actors at different types, cybercrime states, that are developing business models, if you will, to exploit that vulnerability and to do things. So we have essentially, increasing malicious activity. And so you could fix that technology plane to make it hard to engage in these kinds of attacks, but it's probably going to take you 5 to 10 years. You could try to have an international treaty, but it would, if you all agreed, it would take 10 years. So what we're looking to do is to achieve impact in the shorter term on pressing problems. So these boil down to common aversions that states might have. And I have a list of them. I'll tell you a few of them, and these are based on really presentations and interactions with the Chinese and the Russians since 2011. And so it's in a pretty compact form. So the top level one is that there's erosion of confidence in military deterrence. So states are driven into an offensive posture in order to be able to use offense as defense, if you will, because the defenses are very poor. So this is a destabilizing environment for military engagements. We also have insecurity dilemmas in which, because of that feeling of vulnerability, states are competing in this domain, and we have potentially arms races in competing there. We have structural security dilemmas in that you can defeat defense pretty easily with offense. So it makes it, encourages a lot of offense. So the net result is we end up with reduced crisis stability, the danger of momentum-driven cyber conflict, short decision times for decision makers, escalatory pressure when proportionality judgments are misjudged. So you make a mistake about how the other actor will respond. And then the threat of catalytic actors. So you could imagine two powers engage in a crisis, and a third actor comes and causes an outage of the telecommunications infrastructure of one and sets off a conflict. And here in Korea, we have a situation where much of the attacks come through Chinese city of Dalian when they're coming from North Korea. So one of the questions is, what are we trying to do in this activity in the UNGG? And I think we should be trying to solve a problem. And we should pick some of these problems and try to see how could we come up with behaviors that would help reduce them. So one thing that I've suggested is helping to get the proportionality judgments right. So a lot of countries have different systems, are not that clear on the level of provocation. So having a scheme for sharing proportionality judgments would be very good. If you think about the overall system, if attribution is difficult and the capability is unevenly shared across states, so some are quite good at it and others don't have any capability, then deterrence for those states with less capability is going to be lower. And so to the extent that we could have institutions that would pool attribution, we could increase the likelihood of attribution in the overall system and thereby increase generic deterrence. So I think thinking along these lines would really be useful in this activity. And there's many things that could be done so that we should think about prioritizing which ones can achieve the biggest stability impacts most quickly, and comparing that against the countries that would support such a move, and then thinking about the enforcement mechanisms. So this is a real challenge for norms because it's great to behave well, but you may not have much of a reason to behave well. And so self-enforcing norms would be an interesting direction. So this is my general approach. Things can be done in the private sector. Anakin and I have wondered, how do we include the private sector to have them help reduce the potential for malicious activity? But in the first committee, it's really states and what states can do. And so we would need more thinking on that. With that, I'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you very much. I think you presented your views based on your vast the experience on the range of the cyber-related the experience. Okay, our final panelist is Mr. William Busby. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. And I also wish to say thank you to the organisers for arranging for me to be here. It's a great privilege. I have a relatively few thoughts and a great ambition to stick to the 5 minutes. I think that the Gge in 2016 to 2017 needs to try to move forwards rather than backwards. I think if you look at what has been achieved in terms of the reports of 2013 and 2015, the challenge is going to be to get a greater number of states to agree to propositions which actually tell us more than we know at the moment. So that's going to be my first plea. My second plea is that in dealing with norms, that the Gge should try to be more specific and should try to be more detailed. That is easy for me to ask and probably very difficult for a group of 25 to deliver. But nevertheless, that is what I ask. Thirdly, I think that we need to listen. We need to listen to those who have been saying it's not good enough just to say that these rules apply. You've actually got to say how the law applies. I think that needs to be the focus. I think the Gge needs to grasp that challenge. How far it will be able to go, having grasped the challenge, I don't know. But at least if they grasp the challenge and try to look at how the law applies, then I think merely by talking about those issues, they will be taking things forward. I think that there needs to be an attempt to agree more detailed confidence-building measures, an attempt to agree more detailed arrangements for international cooperation, and we need to burrow down more deeply into these ideas of general principles of responsible behaviour. It's all very well talking about responsible behaviour in the abstract. What I think we need to know a little bit more is what responsible behaviour looks like in cyberspace. And all of this needs to be done while maintaining consensus, and that's where it gets difficult. I think we need, as I say, to focus very much on how the law applies. That is a recurring theme that I hear at the various meetings on this subject that I attend. Well, Gge, that's your job. Tell us more than we think we know already. I think undoubtedly there needs to be a focus on identifying where there are gaps in the law. Because when you attend these various international discussions, everybody will tell you that there are gaps, but they won't necessarily share with you exactly where they think the gaps are. My perception has always been that you need to identify the law that applies and how it applies in terms of the legal rules that we currently have, in order then to be able to articulate where the gaps are. I recommend that as an approach, although I fear that there may be some countries that would feel uncomfortable with that sort of approach. As to specifics, I'll give you one specific. This isn't because there is only one specific. This is just because I'm giving you one example of something where I think discussion within the Gge could take us forward. One of the problems that states have is in interpreting when a cyber activity constitutes an unlawful use of force in breach of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, or, as the case may be, constitutes an armed attack giving rise to the inherent national right of self-defence. I think in practice, states are going to apply a number of factors in determining whether they have been subjected to a use of cyber force, an unlawful use of cyber force, or indeed an armed attack. I think what would be very helpful would be if the Gge could identify what those factors would include. I don't think we need an exclusive list. I think we need just some of the factors that will be there, and possibly indicating which among those factors are more important and which perhaps are of lesser importance. My last couple of points are firstly to agree very much with Enneken that we mislead ourselves if we look at this cyber topic in isolation. I think we need to think about developments in ICT in the context of developments in relation to other technologies, for instance, in the weapons or quasi-weapons fields. I have in mind technologies such as autonomy. I have in mind technologies such as the developing human-machine interface. I think when you start thinking about those technologies, you will immediately see how what we agree in relation to cyber as it now is must continue to be relevant as technology in those other areas moves forward. And then finally, I think we need to be prepared to talk about cyber as a good news story. I think we need to think to ourselves, actually, there are certain types of cyber operation in the course of an armed conflict where it might well be possible to reverse the operation, the cyber operation, if it became clear that it was having undesirable effects. This is something that, so far as I'm aware, one can't do if you have dropped a bomb or fired a missile. Once it's exploded, the effects are what the effects are. So I think, using that as an example, we need to be prepared to say when we think the cyber activity has a positive aspect to it, not just a negative aspect. And finally, and this is the third out of the two final points, I totally agree with John here that the priority in what we are seeking to strive towards needs to be stability. I think stability is what all of us are seeking. I think we may be seeking it according to different routes, but the destination remains the same. So keep your focus on the destination and seek to strive for the stability that I think the world is looking for in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very penetrating legal analysis and then very much future-looking the positions. Having heard all five panelists, while I'm very much appreciative all your comments and then the work of the UNGGE, to be frank with you, I think I have still more lingering questions than replies. How to regulate the cyberspace? Maybe I can at least raise some questions to all of you, such as what are the most important achievements in the past UNGGE, and then the biggest challenge that lie ahead of the upcoming UNGGE for next 2 years, and then based on the critical comment by one of our panelists. So, is there any alternative other than UNGG to pursue our stability or legal framework? And then also, I think we are focusing on UNGG, but at the same time, I think we should factor into the opinions and positions of the private sector, and then we should also factor into the technological advancement. So there are many questions. So I just, as moderator, I just raise the questions, and then I give the floor back to Neken, and then open the floor to audience and take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then back to the panel.
Thank you. I would take this opportunity to also reply to Professor Park's questions. What will new members of the Gge bring to this? What would be the third voice? And then the comment on impact of bilateral engagement. And first on this expansion of the group, I very much hope that the third voice will not be a voice of one single country, because we have heard of who are the leading countries of this discourse, and that there also is some fundamental differences between those countries. So I think that the expansion of the UNGGE group gives an excellent opportunity for coalitions of rationality and reason and experience, rather than only coalitions of political alignment. And that is where I'd say that Estonia, Korea, many other countries have a good opportunity to bring some practical questions to the table, and in a way force the two camps out of their trenches. On the question of impact of bilaterals, and you mentioned cyber espionage, I would also contest slightly, but I think more so build on John's emphasis that it is a politico-military discussion. Well, it is, but I would say that the word politico there opens up a conversation that can go from basically a whole spectrum of issues. And if the first committee would be strictly political military, then we wouldn't be discussing the implications of cybercrime or most of the statistics of malicious activities there. We wouldn't be mentioning human rights and private-public partnerships. So we'll come back to the fact that those issues are intertwined. They are intertwined, and that is, if you can't control cybercrime, you are actually prone to a larger attack surface in your country and globally. So I think we're talking about a situation of strategic insecurity due to those factors in so many countries that we need guarantees strategic stability, and that opens up the sort of spectrum of discussions in the Gge. Plus, now coming to a couple of remarks that you made, then we need in the next Gge focus on prevention. Prevention happens in peacetime, hopefully. And the most challenging, I think, factor for the next Gge would be to bring in those civil society, but let's say peacetime, civilian, business as usual considerations, and how we can use them to prevent what we don't want to happen.
Thank you very much. I open the floor to the audience. Maybe take 2 questions. Yeah. Okay, then our panelists are very much capable to persuade all of you. Then maybe then, if that being the case, then I give floor back to the panelists. And so, John, you ask floor, and then William, yeah, okay, yeah.
So I'll just roll out a thought experiment for a possible cyber norm. Supposing we wanted to have something like a non-proliferation regime in this space. And an obvious candidate for this is to prevent dangerous cyber techniques from transferring from cybercrime to cyber terrorism, for example. So that would be one we could think about. More broadly, it has interesting challenges because of the duality of defense and offense. So in an environment where defense is weak, then states want to have some offense to defend themselves. But when we tell them, well, you shouldn't go get some offense, which you've already told them, in fact, do not use your CERT to collect malware that you're then going to reuse and retarget, which is what everybody wants to do. But I think that would be an interesting one to think about, because that actually might drive us in interesting defense techniques. Because what we really need here is lots more defensive capability. We don't want to see offense as defense. It's basically highly destabilizing. And you have examples of you don't know how the interaction is going to take place. So I would just ask the question, what do we think of that idea? Is that something we could do, Anakin?
First, I give the floor back to William, and then you want to respond. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to take you up on the question that you posed about alternatives to the Gge. And I think if you were thinking in terms of an alternative to the Gge, you would probably end up with something that looks remarkably like the Gge that you've got at the moment. Because my take on it, for what little it's worth, is that we are in a situation in which states do not feel ready, and probably aren't ready, to commence any sort of negotiation leading to formal legal provision, whether in the form of a treaty or otherwise. I think states instead are wishing to discuss among themselves where they think we are at the moment, where we feel the risks and dangers and indeed opportunities are, and then to feel a way forward in terms of best practices, norms, confidence-building measures, all the various things that we see reflected in the work of the Gge. I think it isn't an alternative to the Gge, what I'm going to mention, but rather a very useful supplement to it, namely the discussions that take place, whether in smaller groups or indeed in a state-on-state context, where track discussions, as it were, gradually take understandings forward. And so it seems to me that what we have at the moment is probably what we need at this particular stage of the art, if you like. That doesn't mean to say that it will always take this form. It doesn't mean to say that at some point in the future, states may feel that they wish to get together in order to discuss something on a rather more formal basis. I think that would only happen if there were to be an event of some sort that drove the collective view of states in that direction. Absent an event of that nature, I think states prefer to have this slowly sort of approach with succeeding, very iterative reports, gradually achieving greater degrees of detail and granularity, and preferably being undertaken on an inclusive basis, so that states feel that their constituency, their general approach, is being represented in those discussions, either because their state is one of the 25, or because they feel able to identify with some at least of those states that are members of the 25.
Thank you very much. I think, if I understand correctly, for the law of the sea, I think the UN, the international community, especially including United Nations, they discussed for almost 100 years to have very comprehensive law of the sea. Now we have been discussing the cyberspace legal framework for maximum 20 years. So maybe we should be more patient about the pace. Maybe then back to you, and I can some questions. Yeah.
Thank you. And I maybe start at the end. I think we have to be patient because we are in a process of developing an understanding between states. And all those, however you count them, 193, 94, over 200 states, countries are unique when it comes to their experience and their particular ambitions and strengths with these technologies. So it is not an easy consensus. The other thing is I think we need to be patient in that not everything has to be answered at the UN level. And that is another emphasis points for countries like Korea, Estonia, Finland, and many others who have very valuable experience to share directly with other countries. Because I think there is one only other factor that might speed this conversation up other than what Bill mentioned, which I agree, which would be a devastating event. And that is when there will be a critical mass of countries that consider the opportunities narrative more important, more pertinent than the threat narrative. On the non-proliferation regime, and just like some of the conversations here, meanwhile, I think it is very reasonable for every country to look at the whole issue of ICTs and threat management from the perspective of that the ICT penetration in a society, the dependence of the society on these technologies, the chosen dependencies, cybercrime, use of ICTs by non-state actors other than criminals, and then state-on-state actors. It is a spectrum that we cannot, in a way, divide into separate distinguished pieces. So we can do it for the purposes of one or the other question, but we need to look at it as a system. And then I did not comment earlier on the alternatives. I think one of the alternatives, again, this goes to the patient's point, is first of all, the UNGG, no matter how they try, they will not be able to answer all the legal questions. And that is why I think there is some reason in the Russian proposition to divert some of these questions to the 6th committee, to the legal committee. There is also, therefore, a very good reason for academia to do very thorough work, very methodical work on how we can solve some of the issues that we're after, not how we can promote certain norms, but how can we use norms. And then I think there could be also a diversion in the already existing UNGG process to focus more on enforcement, more on how we implement the norms that we already have. And then maybe to develop a sort of living list of new norms and new expectations towards countries. But I believe also in smaller groups and bilaterals power for the purposes of coming up with new threats.
Thank you very much. We are exactly here, to achieve that kind of the small group discussions. Professor Park? Actually, let me remind you that Professor Park of Korea University, he organized this the panel and then all the details of this program. So the very big thanks to you, Professor Park. Yeah, you have floor.
감사합니다. 예. 그 사회자께서 그 Gge의 어치브먼트 챌린지 얼터너티브에 대해서 문제를 제기하셨기 때문에 제가 한두 가지 말씀드리려고 합니다. 그 사실 Gge의 어치브먼트하고 챌린지하고는 서로 그 연결되어 있다고 볼 수 있는데, 우선은 Gge에서 이 국제법이 사이버 공간에 또는 정확하게는 이제 국가에 의한 ICT의 이용에 적용된다라는 것이 이제 컨센서스로 국가들 사이에 합의가 됐는데, 그게 이제 어치브먼트고, 하지만은 이것이 이제 4차 Gge, 이제 5차 Gge 거쳐가면서 아마도 어떻게 국제법이 적용될 것이냐를 다투는 그런 과정에서는 이 퍼스트 커미티에서의 Gge 활동이 상당히 좀 제약을 받지 않을까. 그러니까 그런 점에서라면은 우리 애니켄 발차께서 말씀하신 대로 유엔 총회내에서라면은 퍼스트 커미티에서 6 커미티로 또 가야 되지 않을까. 또 한편은 유엔 Gge가 이런 사이버 시큐리티의 문제를 다루는 그 국제사회에서 사실상 유일한 그러한 이 장이 플레이스가 되고 있는데, 또 그러다 보니 처음에 15개, 20개, 25개 많은 유엔 회원들이 이 작업에 참여하고 싶어하고, 또 그러다 보니 발자께서 말씀하신 대로 뭐 인권 또 다양한 이슈들을 또 함께 고려하려고 하다 보니 사실상 이 유엔 Gge, 현재 Gge가 다룰 수 있는 그런 문제의 한계도 있지 않을까, 그런 생각합니다. 그리고 오늘 마침 발제자부터 여러분께서 이 사이버 시큐리티 문제와 함께 관련된 그러한 문제들도 함께 고려해야 된다라고 하셨는데, 그러한 관련된 문제들을 제가 듣기로는 어떠한 그 군사적인 또 무력 충돌 차원에서 말씀하신 것 같은데, 제가 봤을 때는 이 사이버는 보통 보면 사이버 크라임, 사이버 워페어 하는 식으로 뭔가 좀 그 부정적인 의미에서 쓰고, 좀 긍정적인 의미에서는 뭐 디지털 이코노미, 디지털 트레이드 하는 식으로 쓰고 있는데, 이 사실 디지털 트레이드에서의 핵심, 디지털 이코노미의 핵심이 데이터고, 또 사이버 공간에서의 핵심도 데이터고, 이제 그런 점에서 보면은 우리가 밀리터리 컨플릭트, non 밀리터리, non 컨플릭트 쪽에서 같이 함께 들여다 봐야 되는 그런 지혜도 필요하지 않을까 생각합니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. And then we have just 3-4 minutes left, and then I appreciate all the audience to take part here. And then I think we have very all-around discussion focusing on the role of UNGGE. And then my last speaker is. Thank you.
Thank you. Answering the question of alternatives, or the idea of alternatives, and I agree with Bill that many of the alternatives eventually could become to look like a new Gge. But the fact is that Gge is not a permanent creature. It's a temporary process and needs to be temporary. Now we are talking at it as the inevitable fact, and we are scared of whether we are not, or whether we are in the Gge or not, and it becomes a question of sort of a political life or death. But eventually Gge will come to an end. What are the alternatives? One is to institutionalize not necessarily the whole Gge process, but parts of it. For example, prevention, Enneken mentioned, or attribution. John has been forwarding. Well, we have institutions already there. UNIDIR is doing credible job. Conference on disarmament, perhaps not doing that much, but it is there. These parallel processes, Sixth Committee or ICRC, are perhaps sort of a ways of as well as new institutions probing our way, like walking on a thin ice and hoping that we don't fall through, that we find way forward to stability and reducing insecurity. And of course, regional organizations and bilateral talks are of importance. Although we are dealing with a matter that we sort of speak that everything is interconnected and interdependent, well, regionalism matters because threats are regional, and threats quite often and insecurity is bilateral. So there are sort of a parallel or alternative futures, but not perhaps a single one. But again, Gge is a temporary fora. It is important, but temporary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For your information, Korea continues to participate in Gge. The upcoming Gge, we are expecting participates also, and then in order to conclude, I especially express my appreciation to all the audience, because this item, UN-Gge on cyberspace or information security, is very difficult to understand kind of the issue, but I really appreciate your participating. And then I think for all panelists, I believe you have another opportunity to discuss, interact between you, and also in partnership with Korean practitioner and academia and so on for tomorrow. So all the best for your continuing discussion. So with this, I declare that our meeting is closed. Thank you very much.